certain parts of the world are changing more notably and more visibly than other parts of the world. I think nowhere that I've seen so far in this class has changed as dramatically over the course of my lifespan as the Arctic. And I think it's a really fascinating area showing the effects of environmental change on a particular area and the strategic interests of people within countries and across countries, as well as the possible opportunities that those changes bring to countries, um, as the Arctic. And so this is kind of the second main part of today, IPCC being the first, and the different ways of international cooperation and discussion around the Arctic is the second part. And so I think in the videos that we watched, it shows um, the extent to which major powers have woken up to the opportunities and the risks in these kind of changes. And you can see probably less dramatic, but no less real effects that are going to come to bear in other parts of the world over the next 50 years. But the Arctic, and so yeah, different parts of the world are have the temperature raising more than other parts of the world. Last week I showed you the methane bubbles in Siberia. The videos before this section showed the dramatic decrease in permanent sea ice in the Arctic region, and you can see the Arctic Ocean in this map here, as well as the black line that shows the non exact circle of what would be considered the Arctic, in stretching from Alaska on one side to Greenland, Norway, Sweden on the other side. And then so you have major powers and minor powers, as well as other powers interested both for transportation regions but also resource reasons in an area that was right dating back to Richard Peary a century ago, to places that were incredibly hard to reach, to ones in which now you can have ice-free transportation routes during the summer across the Arctic Ocean, which makes it dramatically quicker to ship things from one part of the world to the other. Side note, there's a whole lot of different videos for those interested in seeing the Arctic region, documentaries about the history of exploration in the areas, for different cultural groups in this part of the world. One of the initial documentaries that got my interest in the region was Michael Palin's Pole to Pole documentary. He did Around the World in 80 Days, and then a couple of other documentaries. Pole to Pole, I think, was the second series, in which he went from the North Pole to the South Pole. Right, it was really fascinating. It was right at the end, after the end of the Cold War, and so he was able he tried to follow one latitude roughly, going from the North Pole to the South Pole, and he got to visit a lot of former Eastern European countries that were just then kind of barely after the end of the Cold War. It was fascinating, but it kind of showed how it was now possible to bring even celebrities to the North Pole all the way to the South Pole. So yeah, if you want to waste time on YouTube, I think it's there, or as a DVD. So yeah, on one side he was holding a ceremonial pole at the North Pole. On the opposite side, there is a U.S. scientific base at the South Pole since the 1950s, in which the U.S. Flies its flag. There's been an Antarctic treaty that protects Antarctica as an area that doesn't have any sovereign control over it. It's only for research, not for any resource extraction. There's been areas claimed by different countries for their area of specific interest, including Australia. But the U.S.'s claim extends all the way to the South Pole, and I think if you have 50 or 60,000 US dollars, you can fly down there or ski down there if you want to. But getting back to the Arctic, The changing weather has led, and long-term climate changes have led to a shift in different politics, as you've seen from that Al Jazeera documentary. It's been warming twice as fast as the rest of the world since the 1980s, leading to, according to the IPCC, which has led to historic amount of loss in sea ice. So now it's not practical for a lot of times for explorers to actually reach there by ski because it's not safe because the ice is so thin to be able to get to the North Pole. There's an overall perception that there isn't any risk for explicit war, though, as the Al Jazeera video showed, there are a lot of increasing capability measures by the U.S. military and discussion, the U.S. military, the Canadian military, the Russian military as well. But there's a lot of ongoing opportunities and challenges to conduct search and rescue to make sure that resource extraction can be done safely, so that if there are increasing tourist boats or trade routes through there, if a boat breaks down, they'll be able to get people off safely. So there's a lot of technological challenges in just opening up those kind of resources. The US and Canada has a long history of trying to extract resources in the northern parts of their country, but in some of these areas, if it's underwater, it just raises that level of difficulty as well. Um, the size and scope of the resources that are being opened up, I don't think the videos really bring across the size and scale of the amount of resources that are there to be taken advantage of. Estimates of up to 90 billion barrels of oil, um, which just dwarfs the world's largest producers like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has is the until recently, I think Saudi Arabia, I think, has the largest proven reserves. The U.S. is the current largest producer, but even Saudi Arabia has only 3% of what's estimated to be in the Arctic, as well as 1.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which is not as much of a difference between Saudi Arabia and the Arctic for oil, but it's still 60% significantly larger than the largest producer, Russia, at the moment. It's interesting to think, of course, that with the changes in the Arctic, there's also some potential time limitation for the usefulness of fossil fuel resources, which can increase the time pressure to try to take advantage of them. If you have countries like the US and China calling for carbon neutrality of their economies, then in 2030, I think China's was in 2060, so we have 40 years there, that you have these resources that people are going to be using for the next couple of decades. But after then, if they're no longer economically feasible and they're so difficult to extract as from the Arctic region, that it could be a resource that doesn't have that same economic value in the future than it does in the next couple of decades, which increases the pressure to move now and to move quickly. There are a couple of other environmental changes from a changing Arctic climate. A couple of ones that relates to the more, not necessarily resource extraction, but just the ecology of the Arctic region. Fish stocks are moving northward. You can see this in the Northeast in the U.S. Some of the fishing stocks that people have depended on for decades are gradually moving northward and often into Canada. The animals that depend on those fish are also moving north, which has implications for protection for these seals and whales as well. Polar bears, I'm sure you've probably seen the David Attenborough documentaries with polar bears trying to hunt on ice floes. That becomes a lot less feasible if the ice disappears. Of course, there's discussion that polar bears may become extinct by 2050, and there's been studies on this. The World Wildlife Foundation found that they've looked at trends in polar bear populations, and that different areas have larger or smaller populations, and those are also, I think, current regions there's just not data for. The areas that are data, some are stable. The most declining ones are out and west towards the northwestern part of Canada. But as you saw with the video of the gyre, the ice moving around, that as that becomes less frequent, they're going to have to be more land based and have it harder time to hunt. Of course, populations have been there hunting those seals and polar bears for thousands of years. The indigenous populations, we saw a bit of that in the Al Jazeera video, have had to adapt to these changing wildlife patterns and economic and political changes that come with the interest on their particular regions and parts of the world. And that's led to culture identity challenges, as well as migration economic challenges as well. A couple of brief transportation challenges that a changing Arctic can introduce. Some things will get easier, like with the Northwest Passage opening up for large transport ships during the summer. It'll help avoid piracy by avoiding areas that are subject to piracy around Somalia, in between Singapore and Indonesia. Tourism will be easier. You can now take boats that go all the way to the North Pole. There's not enough icebreakers to open up these sea lanes safely. The U.S., which has the largest military budget by far of any other country in the world, only has one icebreaker. Australia, we just gave up our last one and we're getting a brand new one, while the U.S. one is definitely more dated, which shows interesting U.S. priorities and maybe on the back foot compared to other countries in this area. So yeah, with uncertain ice, other boats could get caught in those ice flows without them being consistently guided by icebreakers breaking the path. And search and rescue, as you saw in the beginning of that Al Jazeera, is pretty insane with those kind of the climates in the Arctic. I mentioned that Australia has an icebreaker. I wasn't sure how many of you were aware of us being the proud owners of a new icebreaker. We purchased it in 2016. It was built in Poland and is now, I think, undergoing tests before relocating to its new home in Hobart. Our existing icebreaker, the Aurora, was actually made outside of Newcastle in New South Wales, is now being given to the Argentinian Antarctic Division as we're getting our new one. Let's see where it is. Yep, the RSV Nuyina is being built, was built in Romania, sorry, not Poland, starting in May of 2017, and we're now commemorating it with a new stamp. So if you want to go get a commemorative stamp to show your support for Antarctic icebreakers, you can go do that. But it does show the importance and the amount of money that Australia and other countries are showing in being able to maintain access to these icebound regions. And often, like the U.S. icebreaker, it can go from one part of the world, like humpback whales, to the other side, depending on the season. So it breaks open a channel to bring resupplies to McMurdo Station on Ross Island in Antarctica in the spring every year, and then it turns around and then goes up to the other part of the world in Alaska during the polar winter. The Arctic as a region is also an area that was one of the earliest regions to actually be an area for international cooperation. The earliest Antarctic treaty, the Svalbard Treaty, also called the Spitsbergen Treaty, was signed in 1920, came into effect 5 years later. It gave Norway the rights to the Spitsbergen group of Arctic islands. You can see that on the Arctic map. They're way far north from the mainland of Norway. It has gradually been expanded in the number of signatories is now up to 40, including countries that you wouldn't think would normally care about this group of islands farther away from their territory, including China, Japan, India, South Korea. And I think what's important for our understandings for international cooperation in this region is that it set a 200 nautical mile buffer zone around the Svalbard, the Spitsbergen Islands, which has led to some contests with the former Soviet Union and Russia because those 200 nautical miles, if you look at that map, overlaps quite closely with some of the territory on the Russian mainland or their islands as well. And I think this also shows what we'll see, you've probably seen in other classes, the discussion. If you disagree or have problems with an existing treaty, do you try to work within it? Do you want to change the framework, or do you just kind of create a new one, right? In the last couple of years, there was, I think more in 2017 and 2018, there was discussion within the US about whether NATO was still a useful and relevant international military cooperative effort, especially with the U.S. trying to threaten rhetorically, as well as some parts of the budget for NATO, not quite as dramatic as after the end of the Cold War, because NATO was kind of created to oppose the Soviet Union. But the the UN Security Council, as well as countries have changed quite dramatically, their power, their interests, their extent in the 75 years. I think it was just UN Day a couple of days ago, that shows since creation in 1945, the world has changed hugely. So you do create a new organization or a new treaty, or do you work within it? And it's the same with the Arctic, that you have these treaties created before any of these changes in the 1920s. Do you work within the existing treaties, or you try to change it? This is going to be, I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. I might need to break this up into 2 videos, but in trying to think about international responses to a changing system and how international actors have played a role in managing this area, I thought of basically 6 types of governance examples of the Arctic, from less to more organization. Now, I said earlier that norms can be the hardest to form, but they also require the least amount of organization, because everyone's kind of internalized what is expected and what's acceptable behavior. I'm going to touch on each. Bilateral cooperation, as I mentioned earlier, that's just one-on-one, it's easier. Non-state actors also can be effective in governing or encouraging policy responses. The example I use here is the Inuit Circumpolar Council. The Arctic Council, it's not an official international organization, but its members are nation states. Then at the more multilateral kind of end is the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, and then the International Maritime Organization, as these global efforts at trying to regulate what people are allowed to do in this area. So I want to touch on each example of Arctic governance. Why don't I break it up? I'll end this video now, and then I'll start with going through all 6 in the next one.